I want to start by explaining why I'm personally motivated to try to define the concept of writing, and why I think a clear definition of writing is a useful thing to have, regardless of what your particular research agenda might be. For those of you I haven't met before, I'm a linguistic anthropologist, and my special interest is in graphic codes used in small-scale contemporary societies or near contemporary societies. So in the past few years, I've been doing work on new writing systems that have been created within traditionally non-literate communities, mostly in West Africa and also in Southeast Asia and a little bit in the Pacific. I am fascinated by historical cases in which non-literate individuals or communities have managed to reverse engineer the concept of writing. And I've been trying to understand the kinds of strategies that they apply to this very difficult task. How do they ground their emergent systems, and how do these systems change over time? And I'm just as interested in what such societies actually do with writing once they have it. It might be easy to assume that writing has obvious functions, but like any cultural phenomenon, it gets applied in diverse and surprising ways. Currently, I'm looking at message sticks in Indigenous Australia. These are wooden objects inscribed with signs that encode meaning without encoding language. The devices were traditionally sent with special messengers to convey messages over long distances, and the sequences of signs were intended to underpin a verbally reproduced message. Because this is a bit of a contrast to my earlier work, I've been forced to contemplate what makes message sticks similar or different to conventional writing. Can we, in fact, apply the term writing to message sticks and comparable systems? And what are we really doing when we ask that question? What criteria, what assumptions, and what unspoken values are we bringing with us? I'm also motivated, I have to say, by regular questions from lay people who want to ask me, is this or that system writing or not writing, and what is writing anyway? And I get a bit irritated by that formulation because it seems like a clever and important thing to ask, but I also worry that simply asking it promotes a kind of analytic unimaginativeness that directs a whole lot of energy in the wrong place. In other words, there's I guess a part of me that just wants to stop talking about it so we can get on with the actual work. But I think we really do need to talk about the definition of writing. It's a kind of unfinished business in our field, and I hope that I can help somehow to push it forward. So this is why I want to talk about this so-called broad versus narrow debate that's been developing over the last couple of decades within the writing systems research community. To put it very, very simply, certain standard definitions of writing promoted by grapholinguists and other specialists emphasize that writing is glottographic, that is, it must represent language structure in some way. It can do other things too, but it does have to convey linguistic information to qualify as writing. This characterizes what is termed the narrow view. Narrow because it's narrowly limited to language. Oops, gone too far forward. So here's a classic formulation of the narrow view of writing, and it's from Peter Daniels. You might be familiar with it. So writing is defined as a system of more or less permanent marks used to represent an utterance, such a way that it can be recovered more or less exactly without the intervention of the utterer. So for Daniels, writing represents language, but even more specifically, spoken language. It's somewhat permanent, it's somewhat approximate, doesn't have to represent an utterance very well, and it's context independent. It can do its job without any help from supplementary orality or other outside cues. The broad view, meanwhile, maintains that writing shouldn't technically need to represent language. Language is incidental. It just needs to convey information precisely in a conventional way. And here's what I think of as a classic formulation of the broad view, and it's from Elizabeth Hill Boone in 1994, and it's a refinement of a definition from Sampson. So here it is, communication of relatively specific ideas in a conventional way by means of permanent visible marks. So in a broad view, we would apply the term writing to, for example, a winter count from North America over there on the left, that records significant incidents over many years, or a bliss symbolics text that is designed to convey meanings and relationships. Neither of these are representing utterances in a given language, but they would fit Boon's broad definition of writing because the ideas are relatively specific and they are conventional, and therefore, in her view, they ought to be understood as being in the same category as, say, Linear B or the Roman alphabet or the Chinese script. What's interesting to me is that many proponents of the broad view are scholars of and from the Americas, where there are tons of well-documented examples of conventional but non-linguistic graphic codes, or what are termed semasiographic systems. In the Americas, we also get semi-glottographic codes like Aztec hieroglyphs, various Bolivian systems, and potentially even quipus, the famous knotted chord system from the Andes, since there's some discussion over their potential for encoding some aspects of language. So contemporary broadists include scholars like Elizabeth Hill Boone, Galen Brokaw, Walter Mignolo, and others, and they defend the broad account on the grounds of descriptive realities as well as anti-ethnocentrism. So they say these systems should qualify as writing A because this is what people are actually doing with graphic codes, and B, their historical exclusion from the category of writing is basically a consequence of colonial ideology and social evolutionist thought. A very recent paper by Galen Brokaw, for example, makes the point that there is a kind of glottographic exceptionalism where societies get divided on the basis of having or not having glottographic writing. So there's a few key points from his paper, and his proposed solution to this problem is to widen the definition of writing in order to sabotage that ideological maneuver. And I think that the arguments all these scholars make are valid and worth serious attention. But in this talk, I'm going to defend a narrower position, but I'm going to defend it in part using the same kinds of arguments on descriptive observational grounds and on the grounds of avoiding ethnocentric traps. And we'll get to what I think of as a kind of paradox of ethnocentrism towards the end of the talk. Before getting into definitions, I want to establish what it is that a good definition ought to be able to do. And I don't expect any of this part at least to be controversial. So a good definition should isolate the object of analysis, so it must exclude as well as include. So in other words, it should be able to discriminate. It should allow researchers to identify appropriate methodologies for precise research objectives. In other words, on the basis of the definition, you should know how to go about finding something out that you don't already know. And it should avoid reinforcing value-based assumptions that elevate or subordinate different kinds of data. This is a lot to ask, and no definition is going to do this perfectly, but I think this is what we should aspire to. And to be clear, this is a utilitarian exercise. I'm not talking about definitions in terms of dictionary development of how, for example, we might extrapolate the meaning of a lexeme like writing or schrift or écriture or scrittura as these words are used and understood in everyday vernacular speech. I'm not doing historical lexicography or semantics. That's a different kind of exercise. What I'm trying to arrive at in an artificial way is a practical conceptual tool. Another thing I'm not really doing is trying to capture the deep philosophical essence of writing. Anyone interested in exploring those questions, at least from a grapholinguistic angle, should look at Demetrios Miletus's book, which I think does a very good job of this. In fact, his book is called The Nature of Writing, and that's what he's addressing, and with a lot more depth than I can hope to today. A definition is not so ambitious. It's just a mechanism for sorting data so that the data can be assessed within meaningful constraints. So here up front is my personal definition of writing, and we'll come back to this to see how it stands up. So it's an unembodied code. It permits a context-independent reconstruction of linguistic information. It's a bit ugly, but I hope that it does the job of isolating the object of analysis, constraining the choice of analytic methods, and avoiding ethnocentric traps. I arrived at this definition based on my own analysis of very different kinds of graphic codes over the years, but also through reading and reflecting on other people's attempts to think through the question, including people like Daniels and Boone, who I take seriously. which is why I want to now invite you on a brief tour of the intellectual history of attempts to define writing. And speaking of ethnocentrism, I apologize that there's going to be a bias here towards European and American sources because that's what I can read, but I'm conscious that there are different ways of thinking about writing and evaluating writing in other philological traditions. So nonetheless, I hope you'll find my review informative. And what surprised me when I started looking through this intellectual history was that the broad versus narrow debate is not in any way a recent concern or fad within the writing systems literature in the US. It's been with us for a good long time. So I want to show you the very earliest attempt to explicitly define writing that I've succeeded in finding because it's fun. It's a 1755 entry by Louis de Jaucourt in Diderot and D'Alembert's famous Encyclopédie. So this is what he writes. Writing, we will define it following Brebeuf, that ingenious art of painting the word and speaking to the eyes, and by various strokes of drawn figures to give colour and body to thoughts. The method of giving colour, body, or to speak more simply, a kind of existence to thoughts, says Zilia, that witty Peruvian so well known by her works, is done by tracing with a quill little figures that we call letters on a white and thin material that is called paper. These figures have names, and these names mixed together represent the sounds of words. Okay, there's a lot to unpack. It's very florid and confused in a classically 18th century kind of way. But what interests me is that Jaucourt appears to be foregrounding meaning or semantics or even thoughts with the actual sounds of words included almost as an afterthought. And the rest of the entry, it's quite a long entry, goes on to talk about graphic codes around the world, starting with Aztec hieroglyphs. Zilia is the protagonist of an epistolary novel by Françoise de Raffigny, which is structured as a detailed correspondence via quipus between Zilia and her lover. So Zilia is an Inca princess, I believe. And I think this is important because despite Jaucourt's ignorance about all these systems from the Americas and how they work, he's using them to illustrate that writing is a code for conveying ideas. It's not just limited to the phonetic representation of utterances. And he was not alone in this attitude to the concept of writing. In fact, the entry draws heavily from other Enlightenment thinkers who had the same kind of idea. There's a funny sort of utopianism in Enlightenment commentaries on writing, because on the one hand, European scholars saw systems such as Chinese, Egyptian hieroglyphics, Aztec hieroglyphs as basically primitive or immature writing systems, because at that time, they believed them to be non-glottographic, to be kind of pure pictographies. Yet despite this, the same systems offered the tantalizing possibility of transcending language altogether, of accessing a kind of pure Platonic world of thought. And there's a real dilemma there. The systems are primitive, yet perhaps also ultra-modern. So shades of Rousseau, perhaps. And you'll recall that in Enlightenment Europe, there were all kinds of experiments in inventing non-glottographic utopian writing systems that proposed to be universal modes of communication, untethered to any specific language. Early Bliss symbolics or early heptapod B, if you like. I've counted 13 such experiments between 1663 and 1809, and here are just 4 of them. So right off the bat, Jaucourt's definition is very broad, but it's narrow in other ways, because what's also interesting is his insistence that the method of production is part of the definition, in this case, tracing or drawing with a quill on white paper, which would automatically exclude his own words in the encyclopedia itself, since they were produced on a printing press, and thus they don't qualify as writing. And my colleague, Elena Kozlovsky, has pointed out that it might be, a silly thing to include in the definition, but it does reveal something interesting about attitudes and values around handwriting versus the printing press, for example. Now I'm going to fast forward to the end of the Enlightenment period to consider Jean-François Champollion in his Précis of 1824. He rejects the kind of broad view out of hand, and he rejects the sort of utopianism that it appears to imply. He says the following about hypothetical semasiographic or non-linguistic codes. This simple method can only ever be rigorously applied to the notation of a few isolated ideas alone, and cannot, in any case in without outside assistance express the numerous relation of man to external objects, nor all the various relations of these objects to each other. The circumstances of time, integral parts of the objects of our ideas, as well as all our relations with these objects cannot be indicated figuratively. It is therefore wrong to wish to give the fine name of writing to a purely representative method incapable, above all, of expressing the simplest proposition to the letter. Okay, so apart from having a good swipe at those utopian experiments in non-linguistic scripts, he's also clarifying what known historical writing systems can and can't do. For Champollion, writing must be glottographic, and in fact, without this key insight, he would not have been able to do the famous analysis which rendered a decipherment of Egyptian hieroglyphics. And you'll recall that within the 18th century and even in the early 19th century, Egyptology, the dominant view was that hieroglyphics were not representing language. And this fundamental category error resulted in tarot card-like decipherments of signs that look ridiculous to us now. So Athanasius Kircher is a famous example of this practice, but what's lesser known is that Kircher was also among those scholars who invented one of those experimental scripts. There he is in the top left corner. And these scripts that are designed to transcend language altogether. So much for Enlightenment Europe. By the time we get to the 20th century, there are many, many more explicit attempts to put the issue into precise terms and come up with workable definitions. So what I decided to do was to go through the literature and extract 22 individual definitions of writing. And then I've tried to isolate each constitutive element of those definitions. And that the aim of the exercise was to try to understand what scholars of writing think is important about writing. What makes writing writing? Is it language? Is it meaning? Is it something else? And I'm not going to go through each case because we'll be here all day, but I've made a chart plotting the elements of each definition. That chart is, in fact, if you go into the chat, you'll find a link. And so if you're sitting, if it's easy for you to do so, you can quickly click on that link. You can download the chart and you can have a quick look. It's the same as that URL up there in red. So I'll give you a moment to do that. So the chart, as you see it here, is going to be a little bit difficult to see on your screen. And this is only just the snapshot of the first page. And then if you scroll to the end of the chart from that URL, you'll see all the original sources and all the original formulations of the definitions. Okay, so for me, this review exercise was quite revealing because it turns out that there are a lot of things that people think are foundational to the concept of writing that don't have much to do with language or even to do with meaning or communication. For example, in certain definitions, writing must be permanent or portable or material or inscribed on a surface. Even the two definitions I showed you earlier to illustrate broad versus narrow, there they are. They include things other than the relationship of the code to language or meaning, things like relative permanence, conventionality, being visual. So now I want to zero in on just a handful of the more, I guess some of the more influential definitions in order to unpack them. So let's start off with our old friend I.J. Gelb in 1952. Writing is clearly a system of human communication. You can read that. So it's very short and simple. The key attributes are that it is for communicating between humans and that it does so with visible marks that are conventional or systematic, if you like. So it's also curious to me, I would have expected an old conservative like Gelb to cleave to the narrow glottographic view. But the reason for his broad perspective, as Galen Brokaw has pointed out, is simply because he wants to position semasiographies as kind of primordial writing systems on an evolutionary path towards glottography. So Gelb's broad definition is not about being inclusive so much as it is about establishing a progressive hierarchy within the category of writing, something that later broadists will reject strongly. This is Marcel Cohen in 1958. You can read that. So here, Cohen is emphasizing materiality, in particular the properties of durability and portability. And the second part of his definition, he talks about writing in terms of a language prosthetic, where the time-constrained and ephemeral nature of spoken language, or I think even gestural language, is extended by means of the device. But he doesn't care about methods of production or systematicity, and he doesn't really care about what level of language is being represented, at least not explicitly. So I'd be calling it a somewhat narrow definition. So interestingly, many years later in 1980, Gelb, in fact, had another go at defining writing, and he concluded writing in its broadest sense is a recording system or device by means of conventional markings or shapes or colors of objects achieved by the motor action of the hand and received visually by another. This definition to me is a bit of a disaster. Conventionality is there, but somehow writing has to be created by the motor action of the hand, which to me is as, it's pretty much as random as specifying that it has to be produced with a quill. The definition would therefore exclude, again, that very passage which was reproduced mechanically in 1980 on a printing press. And this kind of emphasis on handwriting, it makes me think of, it's kind of like a hipster definition of writing. Writing, in order to be writing, has to be handmade, preferably in a garage somewhere in Portland. Gelb's definition also discounts anything written to oneself, like a diary or a shopping list, since it has to be received by another. So it's broad, but it's weirdly narrow in terms of the mode of production and situational use. Now I'm skipping ahead to John de Francis, and anyone who's read his work knows that he's mad, he's grumpy, he's had enough of everyone's nonsense. He writes, writing, real writing, full writing, first and foremost represents speech, however well or badly it may do its job, even if its role is acknowledged as not being limited to representing speech. The basis for my insistence is no mere assumption of the primacy of speech. The historical reality is that all full systems of writing have been based on speech, and that no set of non-phonetic symbols has ever shown itself capable of conveying anything more than an extremely limited range of thought. So real echoes of Champollion here. In de Francis's terms, writing represents speech, but importantly, it can do more than this and less than this. It's still writing. So he's fending off the pedants who point out all the usual abundant examples of how writing can communicate more than speech, or that it's not very good at representing other aspects of speech, like prosody, for example. And de Francis is very insistent on phonography, that is the graphic representation of linguistic sound, because much of his book is dedicated to debunking the persistent myth that the Chinese script embodies a pure semantic system that is language independent. Okay, and I'll just give you one final example from Michael Coe from 1992. There it is, you can read it. So he's talking about speech specifically as opposed to language more broadly, just like de Francis, but definitely it's a glottographic definition. And again, had he taken the view that glottography versus non-glottography was an irrelevant distinction, he would not have made much progress in his contribution to the decipherment of Mayan writing. Okay, so I think that's enough to say about individual examples. I'm going to bring us back to the chart again to see if we can find any obvious patterns. What you can see is that some of these criteria, it's hard to read, but they're pretty close to each other. So to deal with these nuances, I've tried to group related criteria together so that we can see the definitional elements in terms of a continuum and not get too distracted by minor distinctions. So that's why all these over here if you can see my cursor in the left, are to do with the general systematicity of writing. Then we're talking about the relationship to language, then the forms which writing is manifested, and finally, what characteristics and possibilities writing has in its actual use. So only a few of the 22 definitions care about all four spheres at once. The real polarization is between linguistic and non-linguistic, and this is because half the definitions will focus on linguistic criteria, so that second column there, and not care as much about the rest. The other half will focus on systemic and formal criteria and not worry about language. So once you sort out the nuances from the 18th century to today, the critical concern is between linguistic and non-linguistic, or the broad versus narrow. So what this confirms for me is that while there are different ways of being narrow or broad, the linguistic versus non-linguistic binary is a genuine split in the scholarship. And I think it's an analytically meaningful one. Now let's go back to my criteria for a good definition and see what we do and don't need. So there it is again. The first thing I'll argue is that I don't think we need to care about form or materiality. Just as it was not helpful for Jucourt to talk about a quill, it doesn't help to specify that writing needs to be inscribed on a surface, that it should be portable or durable. Words on the screen of a phone are very portable, but they're not inscribed, and they're not particularly durable. I would still call the ephemeral text of an online chat writing, and I'm sure you would too. I mean, if you genuinely believe that a Snapchat message isn't a manifestation of writing, then I'm happy to hear your arguments. And conversely, monumental inscriptions are not portable, but I would definitely want to analyze them as writing. So as we can see, the problem of specifying formal characteristics or material characteristics is that we then have to predict all possible future innovations in graphic technology, including, for example, tactile systems. It's not, in other words, it's not delimiting the object of study. I would make a different kind of argument about systemic criteria. To say that a code is conventional or combinatorial, that's fine. I'm kind of okay with these, except to say that if the code in question is glottographic, it's going to be all those things anyway, because language is all of those things. Language is systematic and conventional. So they're almost like dependent variables, if you like. Glottography entails systematicity. So this will only matter for identifying or differentiating codes that aren't glottographic. So I want to return to my personal definition and see how well it isolates the object of study. Where are we? There it is on the left. Writing is an unembodied code that models aspects of language structure such that it permits a context-independent reconstruction of linguistic information. This is certainly a narrow definition, but it's nonetheless broader than Daniel's. You can see Daniel's is on the right-hand side. My definition doesn't care about permanence, and it doesn't even care about marks, and it doesn't need to be about representing an utterance. It must, however, model some kind of language structure, but only to the extent that a linguistic signal can be successfully reconstructed. And I like the word model here and not represent, because we're talking about an index rather than an equivalence. So in practice, writing tends to do this modeling mostly phonographically, but in principle, it doesn't need to be exclusively phonographic. Language structure is a broad category that includes phonology on a foundational level, but it's bigger than that. Morphology has structure, syntax has structure, and these things do get captured by writing, whether by accident or design. Even the classic linearity of writing indexes something broadly structural about language, namely the Saussurean principle that it unfolds as a temporal sequence. A few things I've specified that aren't in other definitions. Writing is unembodied, and I think this is important because this is what makes writing a model of language rather than an actual instantiation of language. Writing cannot take an embodied form as a vocalization or a gesture. These modalities are intrinsically linguistic. Sign languages, of course, are not models of language. They are constitutive of language, just as systematic vocalizations are constitutive. And it's the disembodiment of the code that allows writing to do all the cool stuff that we love if we ask it to. So to permit asynchronous communication, generate metapragmatic awareness, to scaffold cognitive processes, if you support the model presented by Karen Lee Overman in this series. But I think a definition should remain agnostic about theoretical extensions like these. These are the potential entailments of writing, but I don't think those entailments need to inform a definition. Related to embodiment, context independence is critical. And here I agree with Daniels. Presented with the same code, another person in another context should be able to retrieve the same signal, or even the same person, but for the sake of argument. Language-centric definitions are useful to me because they help me analyze non-linguistic codes like these just as much as they help me understand linguistic codes like these, with no implication that one kind of code is better than another. They are simply designed to achieve different things. What's crucial is that in practice, these non-linguistic codes over here are in fact very language heavy. It's just that the language is not captured by the code. It's manifested vocally or gesturally by human beings in the interaction. So a winter count or message stick or kipu or a Nashi Dongba manuscript down there in the bottom right corner, these are not context-independent artifacts that manifest their meanings from behind glass cases. They become meaningful in the context of a communicative interaction that involves orality. Someone is there to explicate the winter count, a messenger delivers a verbal message, a kipu compiler verbally expounds from the kipu, and a Nashi ritual specialist intones from a manuscript. And to be clear, it's not that the graphic object generates the oral output, nor that the oral channel fully explains the graphic object. In practice, the two modalities are mutually reinforcing one another. For me, it's important to recognize that the language is embodied in the individual, but not embedded in the visual code. So instead of asking, is there language? I think we should be asking, where is the language? And then you open up a world of understanding. Ignoring or downplaying language, per the broad view, is inviting misrecognition and interpretive failure. It also risks an impoverished view of these codes that are fully animated by language. So I want to see a shift away from an antiquarian perspective of the code sitting by itself and, off in a museum somewhere, and towards a human-centered perspective that is all about the interaction. So if you encountered something like this in an archaeological setting and nobody was around with a cultural authority to explain it, we can at the very least ask hypothetically, where is the language? Is it embedded? Is it externalized? Is it absent altogether because this is perhaps ornamental? The answer to that question would be very important to the eventual analysis. But if you carry around an idea that language is incidental or optional or it's not really doing any work, then you're going to miss this relationship. I'm going to argue against myself very briefly, because I think we need to ask what a definition erases as well as what it reveals. My problem with broad definitions is that they seem to erase the reality of spoken language, but they do reveal something else that narrow definitions tend to occlude, which is that glottographic sign systems are first and foremost sign systems, pretty much like any other. It's just that their systematicity happens to be superimposed on the salient structures of language, as opposed to the structure of a piece of music or a ritual performance or a complex tally of different kinds of goods. And then to draw a circle around them and say, all these things are one category that we can, for convenience, we'll call it writing, I think is a potentially useful way of looking at things for those who are interested in, for example, questions of origins and emergence, which I am. And I think a fairly common understanding is that if you want to end up with in cases where you do end up with a glottographic sign system, you don't start with nothing. You start with a ready-made system designed for something else, and you put it to work. You elaborate it in a special way, and it becomes glottographic. This is also true of scripts invented in modern times within non-literate communities. They don't start with nothing. They exploit existing codes and extend them. There is obviously a danger here in presenting this teleologically, to say, well, therefore, that's what the original sign system was always hoping to be. But I think we're mature enough to avoid that. Sequoia, who invented the Cherokee script, took full advantage of the inherent systematicity, but not the sound values of the Roman alphabet. But nobody would be ridiculous enough to claim that this new Cherokee writing system represented the inevitable and glorious end of the evolutionary journey for the Roman script. two different systems, but applied in different ways. So broad definitions show us what's similar, and narrow definitions show us what's different. And Elizabeth Hilburn does acknowledge this point too. So finally, I want to talk about ethnocentrism and address the objections articulated by some proponents of the broad view. I want to respectfully say two things about Brokaw's recent paper. The first is that there is, I think, a straw man dimension to his denigration of narrow definitions. The hierarchical division of societies based on glottographic literacy or its absence has certainly been a theme of anthropological theory since at least Edward Tyler in the 1870s, but it is not seriously entertained by any living scholars. And I'm afraid I think it devalues decades of critical work to claim it still has currency. I agree with Brokaw nonetheless that we need to deconstruct the broader value system that has elevated writing or glottographic writing as a prestige technology culturally today in the wider community. But the way to do this is not to say that a winter count should now be able to join the exclusive club formerly reserved for glottographic codes. Rather, I think we just need to burn down such clubs altogether. The existence of the exclusive club is the problem, not the bouncer outside it. Semasiographic systems, after all, are not trying and failing to be glottographic writing, nor are they on any kind of inevitable evolutionary path towards it. They're achieving something very different, yet achieving those things perfectly effectively. If we're tempted to expand the exclusive club called writing to include any conventional graphic code, we're simply displacing the prejudice elsewhere. What do we do about those many societies like the San of Southern Africa or the Gunai of Southeastern Australia that have rich visual symbolic culture, but no conventional system of standard graphic notation that would be captured by even the broadest definition of writing? Do they suddenly become societies bereft of writing? It's as if the barbarians are always over the next hill. And I think about recent debates in Australia about wanting to include certain hunter-forager societies that actively manage landscapes within the category of agriculturalists, with the unspoken assumption that the agriculture label elevates them culturally. But who decided that agriculture was a desirable subsistence system? And then what kinds of prejudices do we push onto societies that don't do landscape management or anything that even remotely resembles agriculture in the broadest sense? The fight should be more radical. It should be in decentering the prestige of concepts like glottography or agriculture, not in erasing meaningful difference and thus devaluing or misrecognizing what is actually taking place. All right, that's all. Thank you very much.